Jackson would never forget that Tuesday in summer. The day everything changed began like any other in Red Creek, with the scorching midday sun turning the streets into rivers of dust and despair. He had gone to town to buy supplies, new rope for the stable, some nails, and if there was money left, tobacco. His ranch was 2 hours away, far inland, where civilization barely reached and the town's troubles rarely followed him. He was tying the supply bags to his horse when he heard the voices. Not exactly screams, but that harsh, contemptuous tone people use when they want someone to disappear. Turning, he saw her. An Apache woman stood in front of the general store, her hands clasped together in a gesture that tried to maintain her dignity as she asked for help. Her traditional clothes hung loose over a body far too thin, and her bare feet showed fresh cuts from the rocky road. Mr. Henderson came out of his shop, his face red with fury. He didn't say a word, just made a violent gesture with his hand, telling her to leave. The woman stepped back but didn't go. Instead, she walked to the next door. Jackson watched as she repeated the same pattern over and over, knocking softly on a door, waiting, trying to explain something in broken Spanish, being rejected, moving to the next door. The Martinez Bakery, rejected. Tom Wilson's blacksmith shop, rejected. Mrs. Murphy's fabric store, rejected with insults. What struck Jackson most wasn't the rejection. That was sadly common on the frontier. It was her persistence. Each time a door closed, she adjusted her posture, took a deep breath, and walked to the next one as if every rejection were just a minor obstacle in her path, not the end of her hopes. But bodies don't lie. Jackson could see how her legs trembled with each step, how she had to lean against the walls between doors, how her hands, which tried to stay steady, began to shake uncontrollably. At the 10th door, she stumbled, caught herself quickly, but Jackson had seen that kind of stumble before. It was the body giving up while the mind still wanted to go on. The 11th door was Dr. Miller's. He came out, looked her up and down with a clinical expression, and shook his head. He didn't even let her speak, just closed the door and slid the bolt from inside. Something broke in the woman's expression. She didn't cry, didn't scream, but her face showed absolute defeat for the first time. She staggered toward the wall of the nearest building and slowly let herself sink down until she was sitting on the ground. She closed her eyes, her head dropped forward. Her hands, which had tried to maintain composure all that time, finally gave up and fell lifeless to her sides. Jackson had seen enough. He untied his horse from the post and led it down the street toward where she sat. Each hoofbeat echoed in the tense silence that had fallen over the town. People had stopped pretending they weren't watching. Now they watched openly from windows and doorways, curious to see what the solitary Jackson would do. He stopped in front of her. His shadow fell across the woman's face, shielding her from the brutal sun. She opened her eyes slowly, as if even that simple act required more energy than she had left. Their eyes met, dark eyes, deep, carrying stories Jackson could only imagine. There was no pleading in that gaze, no tears, just a resigned emptiness that cracked something in his chest. Jackson extended his hand to her without a word. The woman looked at it as if it were something from another world. In Red Creek, hands were extended to push, to point toward the exit, to close doors, not to help, not someone like her. Seconds passed, and she didn't move. Jackson kept his hands steady in the air, waiting with a patience that surprised even himself. Finally, with slow, cautious movements, like a wild animal approaching a trap that might be salvation or death, she raised her hand and placed it in his. She was light as a feather, skin and bones, nothing more. Jackson pulled gently, helping her to her feet. She swayed, and he held her arm to keep her from falling. From his office across the street, Morrison came out to the boardwalk, crossed his arms, and watched the scene with calculating eyes. His foreman Dutch stood beside him, chewing tobacco. Jackson ignored the stares, helped the woman onto his horse carefully, aware of every bone protruding beneath the fabric of her clothes. Then he mounted behind her, took the reins, and guided the animal toward the edge of town. No one said anything, but their gazes followed him like shadows. The woman turned slightly in the saddle. Her lips moved, forming a single word Jackson could barely hear over the horse's hoofbeats. Asha, it was her name. She was giving it to him like a gift, like an act of trust she probably shouldn't feel toward a stranger. Jackson, he replied. She nodded weakly and leaned back against his chest, too weak to sit up straight. Jackson adjusted his grip on the reins and urged the horse faster. Behind them, the town kept watching, and in his office, Morrison spat his tobacco on the floor and smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is going to get interesting," he muttered. The sun was beginning its descent as Jackson and Ayesha left the town behind. The road to the ranch was long, but for the first time in years, Jackson didn't feel completely alone. Jackson's ranch wasn't much. A 2-room wooden house, a stable for 4 horses, a small chicken coop, and land stretching as far as the eye could see. It was enough for one man, but barely enough to survive on the unforgiving Texas frontier. Ayesha didn't speak during the entire ride. She stayed rigid in the saddle, as if afraid any movement might break the fragile agreement between them. Jackson didn't try to make conversation either. He knew words could wait. First came food, then everything else. When they reached the ranch, the sun was already setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky shades of purple and orange. Jackson dismounted first, then helped Asha down. Her legs gave way when she touched the ground, and he had to hold her to keep her from falling. "Wait here," Jackson said, guiding her toward the porch and helping her sit on the wooden steps. "I'll make something to eat." Asha nodded without speaking, her eyes following Jackson's every move with a mixture of distrust and desperate hope. She had learned that trusting white men was dangerous, but hunger was stronger than fear. Jackson worked quickly, lit the fire in the iron stove, put water on to boil, and began making a simple stew with dried meat, potatoes, and carrots. It wasn't fancy, but it was hearty and warm. As he cooked, he watched through the window. Asha hadn't moved from the step. She sat with her back straight, gazing at the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone to appear from the mountains. 20 minutes later, Jackson came out with 2 steaming plates, sat beside her on the step, and offered her one. Asha took it with trembling hands and for a moment just looked at it, as if she couldn't believe it was real. "Eat slowly," Jackson warned. "If you eat too fast after going so long without food, you'll get sick." She nodded and began to eat, small bites at first, then larger as her body recognized the food. Jackson ate silently beside her, respecting her need to focus solely on satisfying the hunger that had consumed her for days. When they finished, Asha set her empty plate aside and looked at Jackson directly for the first time. Something was different in her eyes. She was still cautious, but there was a flicker of curiosity now, perhaps even gratitude. "Why?" she asked in her broken Spanish. "Why you help?" Jackson shrugged, gazing at the horizon where the last lights of day were fading. "Everyone needs to eat, and I need help here. The ranch is too much work for one man. Others no help, others hate. Others are fools," Jackson replied simply. "A working hand is a working hand. I don't care where it comes from." Asha processed his words in silence. There was a simple logic in what he said, but she knew that on the frontier, logic rarely won out over hatred and fear. "What happened to your tribe?" Jackson asked after a moment. It wasn't his habit to pry, but he needed to know who he was dealing with. Asha's expression hardened. "They go north, new lands, me sick, fever. They no wait, left me." The story was more common than Jackson wanted to admit. The Apache tribes were being pushed farther and farther away, their lands taken, their resources depleted. Leaving behind the sick wasn't cruelty, it was survival, but that didn't make it hurt less. "And you couldn't catch up to them afterward?" Asha shook her head. "When better, they too far, me alone, walk days, reach town, think maybe whites give food work." She laughed bitterly. "Me wrong." "Until today," Jackson corrected. She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold centuries of pain. "Until today," she repeated softly. The following days established a routine. Asha slept in the small back room Jackson had used for storing tools. He cleaned it as best he could and gave her clean blankets. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping under the stars in hostile territory. During the day, Asha worked. At first, Jackson worried she was too weak, but he was surprised by her resilience. She fed the horses, collected eggs from the chicken coop, helped repair fences. She didn't talk much, but her hands were always busy. What impressed Jackson most was how she handled the animals. The horses, usually nervous around strangers, calmed instantly in her presence. She whispered to them in her Apache language, words Jackson didn't understand but clearly had a magical effect on the animals. "How do you do that?" he asked one day, watching her calm his most temperamental stallion with just a touch to its neck and soft murmuring. Asha smiled faintly, the first real smile Jackson had seen on her face. "Apache no listen animals, they talk, you listen." "Teach me," Jackson said impulsively. She looked at him in surprise. "You want learn? If it works, it'd be useful." Asha considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Tomorrow me teach." That night, as they ate dinner on the porch under the stars, Jackson noticed Asha seemed more relaxed. There was still tension in her shoulders. She still glanced at the shadows as if expecting trouble, but something had changed. Maybe she was beginning to believe this place could be safe, at least for now. "Jackson," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Yes, thank you." It was only 2 words, but coming from her, they meant everything. Jackson nodded, feeling no need to say more. On the frontier, where words were cheap and actions were all that mattered, that simple gratitude was worth more than any speech. But neither of them knew their peace wouldn't last long. In Red Creek, 2 hours away, Morrison was in his office planning. And when Morrison planned, someone always ended up suffering. The storm was coming. It was only a matter of time before it reached Jackson's ranch. The 3rd week of Ayasha's stay at the ranch brought changes Jackson hadn't anticipated. The place felt different, more alive somehow. The plants in the small garden he'd neglected began to flourish under Ayasha's care. The horses shone healthier. Even the house felt more welcoming. Though neither had said much about it, they had developed a language of their own, one that went beyond words. A look meant the water was ready. A gesture indicated the fences needed repair. The silence between them was no longer awkward but comfortable, natural, like the flow of a river that knows its course. But the outside world hadn't forgotten. Jackson was repairing the stable door when he heard the sound of horses approaching. 3 riders appeared on the dusty road leading to his ranch. He recognized the leader immediately, Morrison, with his wide-brimmed black hat and face weathered by years of sun and greed. Asha was near the well, drawing water. At the sight of the riders, her body tensed like a bow ready to fire. Jackson made a subtle gesture with his hand, silently telling her to stay calm. Morrison stopped his horse a few yards from Jackson, flanked by his foreman Dutch and another man Jackson didn't recognize. All 3 looked around the ranch with barely concealed disdain. "Cole," Morrison said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Morrison," Jackson replied without moving from his position, "I don't recall inviting you onto my property." "Don't need an invitation to talk to a neighbor," Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Especially when that neighbor is doing something that affects the whole community. I don't know what you're talking about." Morrison gestured with his chin toward Ayesha, who still stood by the well motionless but alert. "That Apache. People in town are talking. They say you brought her here, that you have her working for you. It's my ranch. I hire who I want." "It's not that simple, Cole." Morrison dismounted, followed by his 2 men. He approached Jackson with slow, deliberate steps. "Red Creek has rules, unwritten rules, but rules nonetheless, and one of them is that we don't bring Apache trouble to our doorstep." "She's not trouble, she's a worker," Dutch laughed scornfully. "A worker, how nice, and what else is she to you, Cole? A pet, entertainment?" Jackson's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice controlled. "Watch your tongue, Dutch. You're on my property, and I won't tolerate that kind of talk." Morrison raised a hand, silencing his foreman. "Easy, everyone. Cole, let's be reasonable. I understand you need help out here. A ranch is a lot of work for one man, but there are right ways to do things. I could send you one of my men, someone reliable, someone who won't make the neighbors nervous." "I don't need your help, Morrison. I have all I need." Morrison walked toward the stable, casually inspecting the repairs Jackson had been making. "Because I hear your horses have been looking better than ever lately. I hear you've got a special touch with them now." He turned abruptly toward Asha, who hadn't stopped watching every movement. "Is it true what they say, that you have Apache magic with animals?" Asha didn't respond, just looked at him with eyes that showed no fear, only ancestral caution. "Speak when you're spoken to, savage," Dutch growled, taking a step toward her. Jackson moved between them so fast Dutch had to stop short. "Take one more step toward her, Dutch, and I'll break your jaw. I don't care who you work for." The tension in the air could be cut with a knife. Morrison's 3 men put their hands near their belts. Jackson kept his posture relaxed but ready. He knew violence when he saw it coming, and this was dangerously close to turning ugly. Morrison broke the silence with a forced laugh. "All right, boys, we didn't come to fight, we came to reason." He turned back to Jackson. "Look, Cole, I know you're a stubborn man, always have been, but think about your future. You've got a good ranch here, good land. Is it worth risking everything for an Apache?" "I'm not risking anything. I'm doing what's right." "Right," Morrison shook his head. "On the frontier, Cole, right is what keeps you alive, and protecting Apache isn't a way to live long." "Is that a threat, Morrison?" "It's neighborly advice." Morrison mounted his horse. "But if you won't take advice, maybe you'll listen to this. The townsfolk are restless. Some are talking about coming out here, about making that Apache leave, and when that happens, I won't be able to stop them. I never asked you to protect me." "No, but you're going to need it." Morrison looked directly at Asha, his eyes cold as steel. "Stay out of trouble, Apache. This town isn't kind to your kind, and if anything bad happens, anything at all, everyone's going to look at this ranch first." Jackson stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "If anyone comes onto my property looking for trouble, I'll greet them the way they deserve, and that includes your men, Morrison." Morrison smiled, but it was a humorless smile. "Big words, Cole. I hope you don't have to prove them." He spurred his horse. "Let's go, boys. We've said what we came to say." The 3 riders rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and implied threats in their wake. Jackson stood motionless until they disappeared completely from view. Then he turned to Asha. She had put down the water bucket and stood with her arms crossed. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes shone with an emotion Jackson couldn't quite decipher. "Are you okay?" he asked. Asha nodded slowly. "Men like him, me know many. They dangerous." "I know. Maybe better me go no want trouble for you." "No." The word came out stronger than Jackson intended. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home now if you want it." Asha looked at him for a long moment, searching for something in his face. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you, Jackson." That night, as the stars shone over the ranch, Jackson couldn't sleep. He knew Morrison wasn't the kind of man who made empty threats. Something was coming, something bad. And when it came, Jackson would have to decide how far he was willing to go to protect a woman who, in just 3 weeks, had become far more important to him than he'd ever imagined. The next 2 weeks passed with deceptive calm. Jackson and Asha worked side by side during the day, and at night they sat on the porch sharing simple meals under the starry sky. Gradually, Asha's Spanish improved, and with it, their conversations grew deeper. She told him about her childhood in the mountains, about her people's traditions, about reading the signs of nature. He told her about his life before the ranch, about the loneliness he'd known since his parents died, about the dreams he had for this piece of land. There were fleeting moments, undeniable, when their eyes would meet and something passed between them, something neither dared to name yet. But Jackson hadn't forgotten Morrison's visit. He slept lightly with his rifle nearby, and he was right to stay alert. The night came without warning. Jackson woke to the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. They weren't the cautious steps of normal visitors, they were the urgent gallop of men with bad intentions. He leaped up, grabbed his rifle, and ran to the window. 4 silhouettes moved in the darkness surrounding the stable. They carried heavy tools and ropes. Jackson recognized the intent immediately, and his blood ran cold. He ran barefoot to Asha's room and knocked on her door. "Asha, wake up. We have trouble." Appeared in seconds, fully dressed. Her survival instincts were so sharp she'd probably heard the horses before he had. "Men outside," Jackson said quickly. "They're going to destroy the stable. Stay here, I'm going to—" "No," Asha interrupted with firmness. "Me help." There was no time to argue. The two slipped out the back door, moving silently through the shadows. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, giving them the advantage. Jackson knew every corner